Blake Harrington stared at the unopened email on his phone. Another acquisition offer for his tech company, Dreamscape Innovations. At 31, Blake had built a digital empire valued at $3 billion, a far cry from his humble beginnings in a small apartment above his parents' struggling hardware store in Westfield, Connecticut. "Would you care for another glass of the 1982 Bordeaux, Mr. Harrington?" The sommelier's voice broke through Blake's concentration. Blake glanced up, his steel-blue eyes taking in the elegant surroundings of Luminescence, Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow over white tablecloths and fine china. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the New York skyline sparkled against the night sky. "Yes, thank you, Dominic," Blake replied, sliding his phone into the pocket of his custom Tom Ford suit. As the sommelier poured the ruby-red liquid into his glass, Blake's mind drifted back to the board meeting earlier that day. His company was on the verge of launching a revolutionary virtual reality platform that would change how people experience digital content forever. The acquisition offer would make him even wealthier, but Blake had never been in this for the money. He was a visionary determined to leave his mark on the world. "Your Dover sole will be out momentarily, sir," the server informed him with a practiced smile. Blake nodded, barely registering the words. He dined alone tonight as he did most evenings. Relationships were complications he couldn't afford in his meticulously ordered life. His ex-fiancée, Addison Winters, had made that painfully clear when she returned his ring 3 years ago, claiming he was married to his company and emotionally unavailable. The memory still stung, though he'd never admit it to anyone. He took a sip of wine, savoring its complex notes. In the background, a jazz quartet played softly, the saxophone's mellow tones blending with the gentle murmur of conversations from nearby tables. This was his sanctuary, a place where he could be alone with his thoughts while still feeling connected to the pulse of the city he loved. His solitude was interrupted by the arrival of his perfectly prepared fish, arranged artfully on bone china with a delicate lemon butter sauce. As Blake picked up his fork, his executive assistant's name flashed on his phone. Vanessa never called after hours unless it was urgent. "Vanessa, what is it?" he answered, his voice clipped and professional. "I'm sorry to disturb your dinner, Mr. Harrington, but Callaway from TechVenture just called. They're threatening to pull out of the partnership if we don't agree to their new terms by tomorrow morning." Blake's jaw tightened. TechVenture's hardware components were crucial for the launch of Dreamscape's new platform. What are they asking for? They want a 15% increase and exclusive rights to distribute in the European market. Absolutely not. Tell them we'll find another supplier. Blake's response was immediate and firm. He never negotiated with ultimatums. "Sir, with all due respect, we can't secure another supplier in time for the launch. We'd have to delay by at least 6 months. Blake pinched the bridge of his nose, feeling a headache forming behind his eyes. "Fine. Tell them I'll meet with Callaway personally tomorrow. 9 a.m. sharp." "Yes, Mr. Harrington. Sorry again for disturbing your evening." Blake ended the call, his appetite suddenly diminished. This was the price of success: constant vigilance, endless negotiations, and the weight of thousands of employees depending on his decisions. Sometimes he wondered if it was all worth it. A commotion near the restaurant's entrance drew his attention. Marco, the maitre d', was speaking in hushed but urgent tones with one of the hosts. Both men looked uncharacteristically flustered. Such displays were unusual in an establishment that prided itself on understated elegance and discretion. Blake returned his attention to his meal, cutting a small piece of fish. He had more important things to worry about than restaurant drama. Tomorrow's meeting with Callaway would require careful preparation. TechVenture was a key strategic partner, but Blake refused to be strong-armed into unfavorable terms. As he chewed thoughtfully, mapping out his negotiation strategy, movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. A small figure had somehow made it past the maitre d' and was weaving through the tables with purposeful determination. It was a child, a girl no more than 10 years old, in a dirty pink sweater and jeans that were too big for her slender frame. Her honey blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her face was smudged with dirt. She looked completely out of place among Luminescence's well-heeled patrons, who were now watching her progress with barely concealed dismay. Blake frowned. Children weren't allowed in Luminescence after 8 p.m., and certainly not unaccompanied. Where were her parents? And how had she managed to slip past the meticulous screening at the door? To his astonishment, the girl was heading straight for his table. Marco was following at a discreet distance, clearly trying to intercept her without causing a scene. Blake made eye contact with the maitre d', giving a slight nod to indicate he'd handle the situation. The girl stopped directly across from Blake, her large hazel eyes studying him with unsettling intensity. Up close, he could see that her sweater had a small tear at the sleeve, and there was a faded Mickey Mouse patch on her jeans. Her sneakers were worn at the edges. "Are you Blake Harrington?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady for someone so young. Blake set down his fork, intrigued despite himself. "I am." "And who might you be, young lady?" "My name is Willow," she said, clutching a worn backpack to her chest. "Willow Patterson. And I think you knew my mom." Something about the name Patterson triggered a distant memory, but Blake couldn't immediately place it. He studied the girl more carefully. There was something vaguely familiar about the shape of her eyes, the set of her chin. "I'm sorry, but I think you might have the wrong person," Blake said gently. "How did you get in here?" The girl, Willow, bit her lip. "I told them I was meeting my dad." She glanced over her shoulder at Marco, who was hovering nearby, clearly unsure whether to intervene. "I don't have anywhere else to go." Blake sighed. This wasn't his problem. He had enough on his plate without dealing with a lost child. He should call security, have them contact the proper authorities. "Where are your parents?" he asked instead, his curiosity getting the better of him. Willow's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them back quickly. "My mom died last week. Cancer." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. "And my dad, well, that's why I'm here." An uncomfortable feeling settled in Blake's stomach. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I don't have any children." "I know," Willow said simply. "But my mom said if anything ever happened to her, I should find you." She dug into her backpack and pulled out a creased envelope. "She gave me this. Said it would explain everything." Blake stared at the envelope, his name written in faded blue ink across the front. The handwriting was hauntingly familiar, though he couldn't immediately place it. With slightly unsteady fingers, he took the envelope from Willow's outstretched hand. "Mr. Harrington," Marco approached cautiously. "Is everything all right? Shall I call security?" Blake looked from the envelope to the girl's face. Those eyes, where had he seen them before? "That won't be necessary, Marco," he heard himself say. "Miss Patterson will be joining me for dinner." Marco's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing his surprise, before he nodded and pulled out the chair across from Blake. "Very good, sir. Shall I bring a children's menu?" "Yes, please," Blake said, then looked at Willow. "Unless you'd prefer something specific?" Willow slid into the chair, her feet dangling several inches above the floor. "Do they have mac and cheese?" she asked hopefully. "I'm sure the chef can prepare something suitable," Marco replied with a small smile before departing. Blake turned his attention back to the envelope in his hands. He should open it immediately, get to the bottom of this strange situation. But something held him back, a vague apprehension about what its contents might reveal. "How did you find me?" he asked Willow, buying himself time. Willow shrugged. "Mom had your picture in a box of old stuff. I Googled you. You're pretty famous." She looked around the restaurant with wide eyes. "This place is fancy. Do famous rich people eat here all the time?" Despite himself, Blake felt a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Sometimes." "How did you get here, Willow?" "Boss. Then I walked." She fidgeted with her napkin. "The guy at the door didn't want to let me in, but I told him my dad was expecting me for dinner. I said it was an emergency." Blake's admiration for her resourcefulness was tempered by concern. "That was very dangerous. You shouldn't travel alone in the city, especially at night." "I didn't have a choice," Willow said with a shrug that seemed too world-weary for her young shoulders. "After Mom died, they were going to put me in foster care. I ran away from the social worker yesterday." The implications of her statement hit Blake like a physical blow. This child had been alone on the streets of New York for at least a day. Looking more closely, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands. "Willow," he said carefully, "I need to open this letter and understand what's happening. But first, let me be clear, we'll need to contact the authorities. They must be looking for you." Fear flashed across her face. "Please don't send me away." "Not yet. Just read the letter first, please." The desperation in her voice stirred something deep within Blake, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Compassion. "All right," he conceded. "I'll read it first." With careful fingers, Blake opened the envelope and removed a handwritten letter. As he unfolded the pages, a small photograph fluttered onto the table. Blake picked it up and his breath caught in his throat. The photo showed a much younger version of himself with his arm around a laughing young woman with honey blonde hair, Eliza Patterson. Memories crashed over him like a wave. His senior year at MIT, the brilliant art student he'd fallen hard for, their whirlwind romance before his first startup took off and consumed his life. With an increasing sense of dread, Blake turned his attention to the letter, Eliza's familiar handwriting blurring slightly as he began to read. "Dear Blake," it began. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone and Willow has found you. I'm sorry to burden you with this after all these years, but she has nowhere else to go. The truth is, Willow is your daughter." The restaurant around Blake seemed to fade away as the implications of those 6 words sank in. His daughter. He looked up at the girl sitting across from him, at Willow, seeing her now with new eyes. The shape of her jawline, the slight dimple in her left cheek when she offered a hesitant smile. His features softened by Eliza's delicate beauty. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Willow nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. "Mom said you didn't know about me. She said you were busy changing the world and she didn't want to hold you back." Blake felt as though the floor beneath him had disappeared. He had a daughter. A 10-year-old daughter he'd never known existed. And now she was here, alone, her mother gone, looking at him with a mixture of hope and fear that made his chest ache. In that moment, sitting in the restaurant where he'd dined 100 times before, surrounded by the trappings of the success he'd worked so relentlessly to achieve, Blake Harrington's carefully constructed world began to crumble around him. Blake stared at the letter in his hands, reading the same paragraph over and over. His mind raced with calculations. 10 years ago he was 21 in his final year at MIT, focused on launching his first startup. He and Eliza had been together for nearly 6 months when he received the investment offer that would change his life. They'd broken up shortly after. He was moving to Silicon Valley, and she was staying in Boston to finish her art degree. Their goodbye had been tearful but amicable. She had never mentioned a pregnancy. "Mr. Harrington?" Marco approached with a child-sized portion of homemade macaroni and cheese. The chef prepared this specially. He set the dish in front of Willow, whose eyes widened at the sight of the food. "Thank you," Blake said automatically, folding the letter and slipping it back into the envelope. He needed time to process this, to think clearly. But Willow was watching him expectantly, her small fingers fidgeting with her fork. "Go ahead," he encouraged, gesturing toward her meal. "You must be hungry." Willow didn't need to be told twice. She dug into the macaroni with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Blake watched her, noticing details he'd missed before, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear just as Eliza used to do, the thoughtful crease between her eyebrows. "When did your mother?" Blake couldn't bring himself to finish the question. Willow swallowed a bite of food. 9 days ago. She was sick for a long time. Her matter-of-fact tone broke his heart a little. "We lived with my grandma, but she died last year. There's nobody else." Blake took a deep breath, trying to center himself. "In the letter, your mother mentioned that I didn't know about you." Willow nodded, taking another bite. "She said she found out she was pregnant after you already left. You were doing important things and she didn't want to mess that up." A wave of emotions crashed over Blake. Anger at Eliza for keeping this secret, guilt for not being there, confusion about what to do now. He had meetings scheduled for the next week, the product launch in just over a month, investors to appease and a multi-billion-dollar company to run. He wasn't equipped to suddenly become responsible for a child. "Willow," he said gently, "I need to make some calls. There are people looking for you and they need to know you're safe." Fear flashed across her face. "You're sending me away." "No," Blake said quickly, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "But we need to do this properly, legally. I can't just take you home with me without talking to the authorities." Willow looked down at her plate. "They'll put me in the system. Mom said that's a bad place for kids." Blake's phone vibrated with another message from Vanessa about tomorrow's meeting with Calloway. He silenced it without looking. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, work could wait. "I promise I won't let that happen," he said firmly. "But I need a little time to figure this out. Will you trust me?" Willow studied him with those penetrating hazel eyes, Eliza's eyes, before nodding slowly. "Okay." Blake signaled for Marco. "Could you please bring us some dessert options? And I'll need a private room to make some calls." Within minutes, Blake was shown to a small office off the main dining room. Willow left contentedly sampling an array of miniature desserts under Marco's watchful eye. Once alone, Blake sank into a leather chair and put his head in his hands. A daughter. He had a daughter he'd never known about. The reality of it sent his mind spinning in 1,000 directions. Should he demand a paternity test? Of course he should, that was the logical step. But looking at Willow's face, he already knew what the results would show. The resemblance was unmistakable once you looked for it. Blake pulled out his phone and called the one person he knew could handle this situation with the necessary discretion. Harper McKinney, his personal attorney, answered on the second ring. "Harper, it's Blake. I need your help with something unusual." "Unusual how?" Harper's voice was instantly alert. In 15 years of friendship dating back to their college days, Blake had never called her after hours for a personal matter. "I'm at Luminescence, and I've just been approached by a 10-year-old girl who claims to be my daughter." A beat of silence. "I assume you have reason to believe this might be true?" "Yes." Blake's voice caught. "Her mother was Eliza Patterson. We dated my senior year at MIT. The artist?" Harper said, recalling their conversations from years ago. "I remember you mentioning her. Where is Eliza now?" "Dead. Cancer apparently. The girl, Willow, says she ran away from social services yesterday. She's been on her own since then." Harper's sharp intake of breath was audible. "Blake, this is serious. If she's a runaway in the system, there's likely already a search underway." "I know. That's why I'm calling you. I need to know what my options are. If she really is my daughter." Blake trailed off, the implications still too overwhelming to articulate. "First things first," Harper said, slipping into her professional mode. "We need to contact the authorities immediately. Running away complicates matters, but if you're willing to assume temporary custody while we sort things out, I can probably make that happen. I'll need to file emergency paperwork." "Do it," Blake said without hesitation. "Whatever it takes." "Blake," Harper's voice softened. "Are you sure about this? Taking responsibility for a child is a huge commitment. You might want to verify paternity before." "I'll get the test done," Blake interrupted, but looking at her, "Harper, I know. And regardless, I can't let her go back into the system. Not after she came all this way to find me." A long pause followed. "All right. I'll make some calls. You stay put with the girl. I'll be there in 30 minutes. After ending the call, Blake sat motionless, staring at the phone in his hand. In the span of an hour, his life had been completely upended. Everything he thought he knew about himself, his past, his future, it had all shifted. He scrolled through his contacts to Vanessa's number. His executive assistant answered immediately. "Mr. Harrington, I was just about to call you. The Callaway meeting. Vanessa, I need you to clear my schedule for the next few days." "I'm sorry?" "All appointments, meetings, everything. Something's come up, a family emergency," he said, the words feeling strange on his tongue. Family. He'd never used that word to describe his life after his parents died. "Of course," Vanessa said, concern evident in her voice. "Is everything all right?" "I don't know yet," Blake answered honestly. "I'll fill you in when I can. Just tell everyone I'm unavailable until further notice." When Blake returned to the dining room, he found Willow chatting animatedly with Marco, who was showing her how to fold a napkin into the shape of a swan. She looked up when Blake approached, her expression instantly guarded again. "Are the police coming to get me?" she asked bluntly. Blake sat down across from her. "My attorney is on her way. She's going to help us sort this out legally. I've promised you won't go back into the system, and I meant it." Hope flickered across Willow's face. "So, you believe me? That you're my dad?" The word dad hit Blake like a physical blow. "I believe your mother wouldn't have sent you to me without good reason," he said carefully. "We'll need to do some tests to make it official, but yes, I think it's very likely that I am your father." Willow's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Mom kept a picture of you in her special box. She said you were the smartest person she ever met." Blake felt a pang of nostalgia. "Your mother was an incredible artist. The most creative mind I've ever known. She taught art at my school before she got too sick," Willow said proudly. "Everyone loved her class." A teacher. Blake tried to imagine Eliza in front of a classroom of children, sharing her passion for art. It suited her far better than the gallery career she'd once dreamed of. "Willow," Blake said, choosing his words carefully, "I need you to understand something. This is all very new to me. I didn't know about you until tonight, and my life isn't, well, it's not set up for a child." Willow's face fell. "You don't want me." "That's not what I'm saying," Blake corrected quickly. "I'm trying to be honest with you. I run a large company. I work long hours. I travel frequently. I live in a penthouse apartment that doesn't have a spare bedroom. What I'm saying is that there will be adjustments. For both of us." Willow considered this, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I don't need much space," she offered. "And I'm good at being quiet when people are working." The statement, delivered with such earnest practicality, caught Blake off guard. This child was preparing to make herself as unobtrusive as possible in his life, to minimize her own needs to accommodate his. It was both heartbreaking and infuriating. What kind of life had she been living that she'd learned to make herself so small? That won't be necessary, Blake said firmly. If you're going to be part of my life, I'll be making changes too. Before Willow could respond, Marco approached their table. Mr. Harrington, there's a Ms. McKinney here to see you. Blake glanced at his watch. Harper had made it in record time. Please show her back. Harper McKinney strode into the dining room with the confident air of someone accustomed to commanding respect. At 43, she was one of the most sought-after attorneys in New York, with a reputation for handling complex cases with ruthless efficiency. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her charcoal suit was as impeccable as it had been for their 9 a.m. meeting earlier that day. Her sharp eyes softened slightly when they landed on Willow. You must be Willow Patterson, she said, extending her hand. I'm Harper McKinney, a friend of Mr. Harrington's. Willow shook her hand tentatively. Are you going to take me away? Harper sat down beside Blake. No, sweetheart. Quite the opposite. I've been on the phone with Child Protective Services for the past 20 minutes. They were very concerned about your whereabouts. Willow's posture stiffened. I'm not going back. You don't have to, Harper assured her. I've explained the situation, that you found your biological father and that he's willing to assume temporary custody while we establish paternity. They've agreed to an emergency placement, pending a home visit tomorrow. Blake blinked in surprise. How did you manage that so quickly? Harper gave him a wry smile. Let's just say I reminded them who pays for the new wing of the children's hospital. Also, it helps that you've never had so much as a parking ticket, and your background check came back spotless. You ran a background check on me? Blake raised an eyebrow. I had it done last year when you joined the hospital board, Harper admitted. Standard procedure. Turning back to Willow, Harper's tone gentled. The social worker assigned to your case is very worried about you. I promised her you'd call her tonight to let her know you're safe. Willow looked to Blake, who nodded encouragingly. It's the right thing to do, Willow. She's just doing her job. With clear reluctance, Willow agreed. Harper handed her phone over, already dialed to the appropriate number. While Willow spoke with the social worker, Harper turned to Blake. You realize what you're getting yourself into, right? She asked quietly. If the paternity test confirms what we already suspect, you'll have the option to seek permanent custody. That means becoming a parent overnight. Blake's gaze drifted to Willow, who was assuring the social worker that yes, she was fine and no, she wasn't in any danger. What's the alternative? Let her go into foster care when I'm perfectly capable of providing for her? Many people would, Harper pointed out. Especially in your position. Children are a massive responsibility, Blake. You've built your entire life around your company. Are you prepared to rearrange those priorities? It was a valid question, one Blake had been asking himself since reading Eliza's letter. Was he prepared to become a father? To put someone else's needs before his own, possibly even before the company he'd sacrificed everything to build? Looking at Willow, at his daughter, Blake knew there was only one answer he could live with. I'll figure it out, he said firmly. One step at a time. Harper studied him for a long moment before nodding. All right then. Let's get the paperwork started. An hour later, Blake found himself guiding a sleepy Willow through the private entrance of his building on Central Park West. The doorman, Reginald, did an admirable job of hiding his surprise at seeing Blake with a child. Good evening, Mr. Harrington, he said, holding the door open. Shall I have anything sent up? Not tonight, thank you, Reginald, Blake replied. But I'd appreciate it if you could have someone bring up an extra set of towels. The elevator ride to the penthouse was silent, Willow shifting nervously from foot to foot as they ascended to the top floor. Blake realized she must be feeling as overwhelmed as he was, if not more so. Her entire world had changed in the span of hours. It's just the two of us, he said, breaking the silence. I don't have any staff that live in, though a housekeeper comes 3 times a week. Willow nodded, clutching her worn backpack. How big is your house? It's an apartment, Blake corrected as the elevator doors opened directly into his foyer. Though I suppose it's fairly large by New York standards. That was an understatement. Blake's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the building, with over 5,000 square feet of living space. The entry opened into a grand living room with 20-foot ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Central Park. Modern furnishings in shades of gray and blue complemented the minimalist aesthetic Blake preferred. Willow stepped into the space, her eyes widening as she took in the view. Whoa! Blake suddenly saw his home through her eyes, the stark, museum-like quality of it, the absence of personal touches. It was a showcase, not a home. Certainly not a place designed for a child. "Let me show you where you can sleep tonight," he said, leading her past the kitchen with its gleaming marble countertops and professional-grade appliances that he rarely used. They passed his home office, the door currently closed, and continued down the hall to the guest suite. "You can stay here for now," Blake said, opening the door to reveal a spacious bedroom with an attached bathroom. Like the rest of the apartment, it was decorated in muted tones with minimal furnishings. A queen-sized bed, nightstands, a dresser, and a chaise lounge by the window. Willow entered hesitantly, placing her backpack on the bed. "It's bigger than our whole apartment was." The comment hung in the air, a stark reminder of the vast gulf between their experiences. Blake cleared his throat, suddenly uncertain of the protocol. What did one do with a newly discovered 10-year-old daughter at nearly midnight? "Are you hungry? I could order something else if the mac and cheese wasn't enough." Willow shook her head. "I'm really tired." Of course she was. The poor kid had been on her own for over a day, navigating a city that was overwhelming even for adults. "Right. Well, the bathroom is through there," Blake gestured to the door in the corner. "There should be a new toothbrush in the drawer. And towels if you want a shower." Willow nodded, her small shoulders slumping with exhaustion. "Thank you for not sending me away." The simple statement hit Blake squarely in the chest. "You don't need to thank me for that, Willow. Ever." After showing her how to work the shower controls and assuring her he'd be just down the hall if she needed anything, Blake retreated to his own bedroom. He sat on the edge of his bed, loosening his tie, the events of the evening playing on a loop in his mind. He had a daughter. In 10 years of building his empire, it had never once occurred to him that he might have fathered a child. The timing aligned perfectly with his breakup with Eliza. She must have discovered the pregnancy after he'd already moved to California. Why hadn't she told him? The question burned in his mind, along with a growing sense of anger. He'd had a right to know. A right to be part of his daughter's life from the beginning. But beneath the anger was a deeper, more painful emotion: regret. What kind of man had he become that Eliza believed he would choose his career over his own child? The worst part was looking back at who he'd been at 21. Ambitious, single-minded, obsessed with success. She might have been right. Blake pulled out his phone and navigated to his email, finding the message from earlier. The acquisition offer would make him another billion, give or take. Just last night, it had seemed like the most important decision facing him. Now it felt trivial compared to the responsibility that had just landed in his lap. With a sigh, he set the phone aside. Tomorrow would bring a flood of new challenges. The social worker's visit, the paternity test, legal proceedings, not to mention figuring out what a 10-year-old actually needed on a day-to-day basis. For tonight, though, the most important thing was ensuring Willow felt safe. Blake changed into a t-shirt and sweatpants before making his way back to the guest room. The door was slightly ajar and he could hear the shower running. He took the opportunity to quickly inspect the space, realizing there was nothing remotely child-friendly about it. The bedside lamp emitted a harsh white light, and the abstract painting on the wall, while valuable, was hardly comforting. The room was designed for visiting business associates, not for a grieving 10-year-old who had just lost her mother. He made a mental note to have Vanessa coordinate some immediate changes. Warmer lighting, perhaps some colorful bedding, definitely some age-appropriate books. There was a spare room currently used as a home gym that could be converted into a proper bedroom for Willow. It would need to be painted, furnished. Blake caught himself. He was approaching this like a business problem, something to be solved with efficient delegation and proper resources. But integrating a child into his life, his daughter, would require more than logistical adjustments. It would demand emotional resources he wasn't sure he possessed. The shower turned off, and Blake stepped back into the hallway, not wanting to invade Willow's privacy. A few minutes later, she emerged wearing the same clothes she'd arrived in, her hair damp and her face flushed from the hot water. "Feel better?" Blake asked. Willow nodded. "Your shower has like 10 buttons." "Just the 6, Blake said with a small smile. "Did you find everything you need?" Another nod. "I don't have pajamas," she admitted, looking down at her rumpled clothes. "Most of my stuff is still at our apartment." "We'll get your things tomorrow," Blake promised. "For tonight." He considered his options. "Wait here." He returned a moment later with one of his MIT t-shirts. It would be enormous on her slender frame, but it was better than sleeping in jeans. "Will this work?" Willow accepted the shirt with a tentative smile. thanks. Get some rest, Blake said, stepping back toward the door. We have a busy day ahead of us. He was halfway out the door when Willow's voice stopped him. Mr. Harrington? What should I call you? The question caught him off guard. Mr. Harrington was too formal, clearly, but Dad felt premature, even if biology confirmed their relationship. Blake is fine for now, he said after a moment. We'll figure everything else out as we go. Willow seemed satisfied with this answer. Good night, Blake. Good night, Willow. Blake closed the door softly behind him, then stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the quiet sounds of Willow settling into bed. In 24 hours his life had undergone a seismic shift. Tomorrow would bring more changes, more challenges. But for the first time in years, Blake felt something unexpected stirring within him. A sense of purpose that had nothing to do with stock prices or market share. This unexpected girl with her mother's eyes and his stubborn chin had turned his world upside down. And somehow, standing alone in the hallway of his perfect, impersonal penthouse, Blake Harrington found himself smiling at the thought. Blake awoke to unfamiliar sounds in his apartment. For a moment, he lay still, disoriented, before the events of the previous night came rushing back. Willow. His daughter. The realization still felt surreal, like something from someone else's life. Glancing at his phone, he saw it was barely 6:30 a.m., yet he could hear movement in the kitchen. Blake pulled on a robe and made his way down the hall, unsure what to expect. He found Willow sitting cross-legged on one of the bar stools at the kitchen island, a bowl of cereal in front of her. She was still wearing his oversized MIT shirt, the sleeves rolled up several times to free her hands. When she spotted him, she froze, spoon halfway to her mouth. I found the cereal, she said, a hint of uncertainty in her voice. Is that okay? Of course, Blake assured her, moving toward the coffee machine. You don't need to ask permission to eat. This is, well, it's your home now too. The words felt strange coming out of his mouth, but Blake was surprised to find he meant them. The paternity test results wouldn't come back for a couple of days, but deep down he already knew. Willow was his daughter. The social worker is coming at 10, Blake continued, measuring coffee into the filter. Harper, Ms. McKinney will be here as well. They'll want to talk to both of us, make sure this arrangement is suitable. Willow nodded solemnly. Will they ask me questions? Probably, Blake acknowledged. They need to ensure you're safe and that this is what you want. What if they say no? The vulnerability in her voice was palpable. Blake turned to face her fully. They won't. I promise you that. Harper is very good at her job and He hesitated, then continued with conviction. I'm not going to let anyone take you away. Relief washed over Willow's face and she returned to her cereal with more enthusiasm. After the meeting we should get you some clothes and whatever else you need, Blake said, pouring his coffee. I've cleared my schedule for the week. Willow's eyes widened. You don't have to work? I do, Blake admitted, but most of it can be handled remotely. The company existed before me, and it can survive a few days without me micromanaging everything. The truth was, Blake had spent half the night sending emails, rescheduling meetings, and arranging for his COO, Xavier Donovan, to handle the Callaway negotiations. Xavier had been understandably shocked. In 10 years, Blake had never voluntarily stepped back from a critical negotiation, but had risen to the occasion admirably. As they finished breakfast, Blake's phone rang. It was Vanessa. Good morning, Mr. Harrington. I've arranged everything as requested. The interior designer will be arriving at 3 to discuss converting the home gym. Pediatrician Dr. Eleanor Chen can see you tomorrow at 9. She comes highly recommended and is very discreet. I've also taken the liberty of researching schools in the area, though enrollment mid-year might be challenging. Blake blinked, impressed as always by Vanessa's efficiency. Thank you. That's extremely helpful. Of course. And Mr. Donovan asked me to inform you that the Callaway meeting has been moved to tomorrow. He feels confident he can handle it but wanted to keep you in the loop. Perfect. Tell him to proceed as we discussed. I'll check in later today. After ending the call, Blake noticed Willow watching him curiously. That was my assistant, he explained. She's helping us get things organized. You have someone who just helps you all day? Willow asked, clearly fascinated by the concept. I do, Blake nodded. Vanessa keeps my professional life running smoothly. I'm not sure what I'd do without her. Mom used to say you were important, Willow said, carrying her empty bowl to the sink. She had magazine articles about you in her box. Blake felt a pang at the mention of Eliza. There were so many questions he wanted to ask about her life, about the years he'd missed. But he sensed Willow wasn't ready for that conversation yet. The wound of her mother's death was still too fresh. "Willow," he said carefully, "I know this is all happening very quickly. If there's anything you need or if you're feeling overwhelmed, I want you to tell me." He paused, searching for the right words. "I'm new at this. Being a father. I'm going to make mistakes, but I promise I'll always try to fix them." Willow considered this, her expression serious beyond her years. "Mom said you were smart. That you could figure out any problem." A small smile tugged at her lips. "But she also said you were stubborn and worked too hard." Blake laughed, the sound surprising both of them. She was right about all of that. The doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of Harper and the social worker. The next 2 hours were a blur of questions, paperwork, and discussions about Willow's needs. Ms. Janelle Brooks, the social worker assigned to Willow's case, was a stern-faced woman in her 50s who clearly took her job very seriously. "While the paternity test is pending, this is considered an emergency placement," Ms. Brooks explained, her gaze moving between Blake and Willow. "I'll need to conduct follow-up visits weekly for the first month." "Of course," Blake agreed readily. "Whatever is necessary." Ms. Brooks softened slightly. "It's unusual for a biological parent with no prior relationship to the child to seek immediate custody. Most would proceed more cautiously. Most aren't in a position to provide the stability Willow needs right now," Blake pointed out. "I am." The social worker nodded, making a note in her file. "Willow, would it be all right if we spoke privately for a few minutes?" Willow glanced at Blake, who nodded encouragingly. "It's standard procedure," he assured her. "I'll be right in the next room with Harper." While Willow and Ms. Brooks talked in the living room, Blake paced the kitchen, anxiety churning in his stomach. "What if she decides this isn't suitable?" he asked Harper in a low voice. "She won't," Harper said confidently. "Your home is safe, you have the resources to provide for Willow, and most importantly, she wants to be here. That counts for a lot." Blake nodded but couldn't shake his unease. "I keep thinking about everything that could go wrong. I don't know the first thing about raising a child. What if I mess this up?" Harper's expression softened. "Every parent feels that way, Blake. Even the ones who have 9 months to prepare. You're being thrown into the deep end, but if anyone can adapt quickly, it's you." Before Blake could respond, Ms. Brooks and Willow returned. The social worker's expression was unreadable as she gathered her papers. "Well, Mr. Harrington, I've completed my initial assessment. Willow has expressed a strong desire to remain in your care, and given the circumstances, I believe that's in her best interest for now." Ms. Brooks handed him a business card. "I'll be checking in regularly and you can call me anytime with questions. Parenting resources are listed on the back." Relief washed over Blake. "Thank you." After Ms. Brooks and Harper departed, Blake turned to Willow with a tentative smile. "That went well. How about we get you some proper clothes now?" The rest of the day passed in a whirlwind of activity. Blake, who routinely negotiated multimillion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, found himself completely out of his depth in a department store children's section. Thankfully, Willow knew her sizes and had clear preferences, politely but firmly steering him away from his more extravagant suggestions. "You don't need a $1,000 coat," she informed him when he picked up a designer jacket. "Kids grow too fast. Mom always said it's silly to spend a lot on clothes that won't fit in 6 months." It was moments like these, small glimpses of Eliza's practical wisdom shining through in their daughter, that hit Blake hardest. He had missed so much, not just of Willow's life, but of Eliza's evolution from the free-spirited art student he'd known to the pragmatic single mother she'd become. By mid-afternoon, they had acquired enough necessities to fill the back of Blake's town car. The interior designer had come and gone, leaving behind swatches and sketches for Willow's new bedroom. They'd settled on a space theme. Willow, it turned out, had a passionate interest in astronomy that she'd inherited from neither parent. "Mom got me a telescope for my birthday last year," she explained as they unpacked her new clothes. "We used to go to the roof of our building to look at the stars. I left it at the apartment, though. We'll get it back," Blake promised. "And maybe set up a better observation area here. The view from the terrace is pretty good, though the city lights make it harder to see the stars clearly." Willow's face lit up. "Really? That would be amazing." Her excitement faded quickly. "But you're probably too busy for stuff like that." Blake felt the comment like a physical ache. Here was this child, his child, already assuming she'd be an afterthought in his life, just as he had been in his own father's. The parallel was uncomfortable, a stark reminder of everything he'd promised himself he wouldn't become. "I'm never too busy for you," he said firmly. That's something you need to know right now, Willow? Work is important, yes, but it's just work. You're more important. Willow looked skeptical and Blake couldn't blame her. Words were easy. It would take time and consistent action to prove he meant them. His phone buzzed with an incoming call from Xavier. Blake hesitated, then silenced it. How about we order some dinner? You can pick whatever you want. Later that evening, after Willow had gone to bed, Blake sat in his office, catching up on the day's business developments. Xavier had sent a detailed report on the Callaway situation, along with a proposed negotiation strategy for tomorrow's meeting. Blake reviewed it quickly, made a few annotations and sent it back with his approval. Next came the latest updates on the VR platform launch from his technical team. The reports were thorough, the progress steady. A week ago, Blake would have spent hours analyzing every detail, searching for potential issues, ensuring everything was perfect. Tonight, he skimmed the executive summary and forwarded it to his CTO with a brief note of confidence. Blake leaned back in his chair, realizing something profound had shifted within him. The company still mattered, of course it did, but its success or failure no longer defined him completely. There was something else now, someone else who needed him in a way his employees and shareholders never would. A soft knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. Blake looked up to see Willow standing in the doorway, drowsy but clearly unable to sleep. "Everything okay?" he asked, immediately setting aside his laptop. Willow shrugged, her thin shoulders rising and falling beneath his oversized t-shirt. "I had a dream about Mom. I woke up and, it feels weird being in a new place." Blake nodded in understanding. "Would you like some hot chocolate? My mother used to make it for me when I couldn't sleep." Willow's face brightened slightly. "With marshmallows?" "I don't think I have any," Blake admitted. "But we can put it on the shopping list for tomorrow." In the kitchen, Blake heated milk in a saucepan, stirring in cocoa powder and a touch of vanilla. His mother's recipe, one of the few things he'd retained from his childhood home. Willow perched on a bar stool, watching him work with curious eyes. "Did your mom make hot chocolate a lot?" she asked. Blake nodded, a bittersweet smile playing on his lips. "She did. Especially after my father left. It was our special thing." "Your dad left?" Willow's question was direct, without the awkward hesitation adults might have shown. "When I was 8, Blake confirmed, pouring the hot chocolate into mugs. "He decided his business was more important than his family. We didn't see much of him after that." The parallels to his own situation weren't lost on Blake. How different was he, really, from the man he'd resented for most of his life? He'd built his identity around his work, pushed away meaningful relationships, prioritized success over everything else. "Is that why you work so much?" Willow asked, her perception startling him. To be different from him? Blake nearly dropped the mug he was holding. "That's surprisingly insightful for someone your age." Willow shrugged, accepting the hot chocolate. "Mom said, I'm an old soul." Her voice caught on the correction, a painful reminder of her recent loss. Blake sat beside her at the island, careful to give her space. "Do you want to talk about her? About your mom?" Willow stared into her mug for a long moment. She was really brave. Even when she was really sick, she still tried to make everything normal. She never complained. "That sounds like Eliza," Blake said softly. "She was the strongest person I knew in college. Nothing ever seemed to shake her." "She talked about you sometimes," Willow admitted. "Not a lot, but when I asked, she said you were going to change the world with your ideas." Blake's throat tightened. "I wish she had told me about you. I would have." He trailed off, uncertain what he would have done at 21, facing unexpected fatherhood on the cusp of his first major business venture. "Would you have stayed?" Willow asked, the question hanging heavy between them. Blake considered lying, offering her the comfort of a simple yes. But Willow deserved better than that. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I was young and extremely focused on my career. But I'd like to think I would have at least been part of your life. That I would have supported you both, been there for important moments." Willow nodded, seeming to appreciate his honesty. "Mom said you two were too different. That you were meant for bigger things than she was." "She was wrong about that," Blake said firmly. "Your mother was brilliant in her own way. Just because our paths went in different directions doesn't mean hers was any less valuable. She raised you after all. There's no bigger accomplishment than that." They sat in companionable silence for a while, sipping their hot chocolate. Blake found himself studying Willow's profile, cataloging the features she'd inherited from him and those that were purely Eliza. The shape of her eyes was his, but the thoughtful expression in them was all her mother. "Blake." Willow's voice was hesitant. What happens if the test says you're not my dad? The question caught him off guard. He'd been so certain of their biological connection that he hadn't seriously considered the alternative. The test will confirm what we already know, he said confidently. But even if by some strange circumstance it didn't, it wouldn't change anything. You came to me for help, and I'm not going to abandon you. Relief washed over Willow's face. Promise? I promise. And in that moment, Blake realized he meant it completely. Whatever the test showed, this child had already carved out a place in his heart that couldn't be undone by mere biology. 2 days later, Blake sat in his home office on a video call with Dr. Helena Kapoor, the geneticist who had expedited their paternity test. The results are conclusive, Mr. Harrington, Dr. Kapoor said, her expression professionally neutral. The probability of paternity is 99.9997%. Willow Patterson is unquestionably your biological daughter. Even though he'd expected this outcome, hearing it confirmed sent a wave of emotion through Blake that he hadn't anticipated. Relief, joy, and a renewed sense of responsibility crashed over him simultaneously. Thank you, doctor, he managed, his voice steadier than he felt. I appreciate your discretion in this matter. After ending the call, Blake sat motionless, letting the reality fully sink in. He was a father. Had been for 10 years without knowing it. Now it was official, indisputable. A soft knock on the door drew his attention. Willow stood there, her expression anxious. She'd insisted on staying in the next room during the call, too nervous to participate directly but unwilling to be far away when the results came in. Well, she asked, her voice small. Blake felt a smile spread across his face. It's official. You're stuck with me. Willow's entire body seemed to sag with relief. She crossed the room in quick steps and, to Blake's surprise, threw her arms around him in a fierce hug. It was the first time she'd initiated physical contact, and the significance wasn't lost on him. Carefully he returned the embrace, his heart hammering in his chest. So what happens now? Willow asked, pulling back slightly. Now we make it permanent, Blake said. Harper is already preparing the paperwork for full legal custody. The words hung in the air between them, their weight and meaning sinking in for both of them. This wasn't a temporary arrangement anymore. This was forever. Does this mean? Willow hesitated, biting her lip. Should I call you Dad now? The question caught Blake off guard. In the whirlwind of the past few days, he hadn't given much thought to what Willow might call him. You can call me whatever feels right to you, he said carefully. There's no rush to figure everything out at once. Willow nodded, clearly relieved not to be pressured. I think I'll stick with Blake for now. If that's okay. More than okay, Blake assured her. The following weeks brought a flurry of changes to Blake's carefully ordered life. Willow's bedroom was completed, a beautiful space with deep blue walls, glow-in-the-dark constellations on the ceiling, and a telescope set up by the window. They'd retrieved her belongings from Eliza's apartment, a bittersweet experience that had left them both emotionally drained but somehow closer. Blake had enacted work-from-home days 3 times a week to be present for Willow's after-school hours. The prestigious Westfield Academy had accepted her mid-year enrollment, partly due to her excellent academic record and partly, Blake suspected, because of the generous donation he'd made to their science department. The transition hadn't been without challenges. Willow still had nightmares about her mother, still had days where grief overwhelmed her. Blake had arranged for her to see a child psychologist specializing in bereavement, Dr. Naomi Wright, who was helping her process her loss in healthy ways. For his part, Blake was learning to navigate the complexities of parenthood one day at a time. He'd made mistakes, scheduling an important international call during Willow's science fair, forgetting that 10-year-olds needed far more structured bedtimes than adults, underestimating how quickly a child could go from perfectly fine to completely melting down when hungry or tired. But he was learning. They both were. On a crisp Saturday morning 3 months after Willow had first appeared at his restaurant table, Blake found himself sitting on a bench in Central Park, watching as she fed ducks by the pond. Her laughter carried across the water, lighter and more carefree than he'd heard before. The change in her since those first days was remarkable. She was more confident, more willing to express her needs, more like a typical 10-year-old and less like the solemn, too mature child who had found him that night. Blake's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Xavier, calling about the European expansion they'd been planning for months. Blake glanced at Willow, then back at his phone. After a moment's consideration, he declined the call and turned off his notifications. The work would still be there tomorrow. This moment wouldn't. As if sensing his attention, Willow looked up and waved enthusiastically, pointing at a particularly bold duck that was attempting to climb onto the shore for more bread. Blake waved back, a warmth spreading through his chest that had become increasingly familiar over the past months. Later that afternoon, as they walked back to the apartment, Willow's hand slipped into his, another first. Blake squeezed it gently, marveling at how something so simple could feel so monumental. "Blake?" Willow asked as they waited for the crosswalk signal. "Are you happy? With everything changing, I mean." Blake looked down at her, surprised by the question. "I am," he said, realizing as the words left his mouth that they were entirely true. "Happier than I've been in a very long time." Willow nodded, seeming satisfied. "Me too," she admitted quietly. "I still miss Mom every day, but—" She trailed off, struggling to articulate complex emotions. "But it's possible to be sad about one thing and happy about another at the same time," Blake finished for her. "Both feelings can exist together." "Exactly," Willow said, looking relieved that he understood. As they resumed walking, Blake reflected on the profound shift in his priorities over the past months. The company was still thriving, perhaps even more so now that he'd been forced to delegate and trust his leadership team. The VR platform had launched successfully, market share was growing, and investors were pleased. But none of that seemed to matter as much as the small hand clasped in his, the trust it represented, the responsibility it carried. In his office, hanging on the wall beside his business accolades and degrees, was a new addition. A somewhat wobbly portrait Willow had painted of the two of them, stick figures standing beside what was clearly meant to be the Central Park duck pond. She'd given it to him for his birthday, shy but proud of her work. It was now his most treasured possession. That evening, after Willow had gone to bed, Blake sat on his terrace with a glass of scotch, gazing out at the city lights. His phone buzzed again, an email notification from a potential investor who'd been courting Dreamscape for months. Before Willow, Blake would have dropped everything to respond immediately. Now he simply silenced the device and returned it to his pocket. The stars were barely visible through the city's light pollution, but Blake found himself searching for them anyway, thinking of Willow's fascination with the night sky. Perhaps they could take a trip upstate soon, find a spot dark enough to see the Milky Way. He'd have to rearrange some meetings, delegate a few more responsibilities, but it would be worth it to see her face light up with wonder. Blake smiled to himself, realizing how completely his worldview had transformed. Success used to mean stock prices, market domination, industry recognition. Now it meant a 10-year-old's laughter, small hands reaching for his, progress measured in trust earned and comfort given. The unexpected little girl who had approached his table that night hadn't just disrupted his carefully constructed life. She had completed it, filling a void he hadn't even recognized was there. In seeking to provide Willow with stability and security, Blake had found something far more valuable for himself. Purpose beyond profit, connection beyond commerce, and a love more fulfilling than any business success could ever be. Sometimes the most precious things in life come from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, the family you never knew you needed is the one that saves you from the emptiness of success without meaning. If you're enjoying this video and want more content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. That way you won't miss out on any of the amazing stories/videos we have coming up. Your support really helps the channel grow and keeps us bringing you more of what you love. Thank you.